The trend of aromatic enhancement expanded to include sophisticated wax sealing techniques. Closing seals could be exquisitely scented with specialized oils, then impressed with elaborate family crests, leaving behind lasting aromatic impressions. Nothing quite communicated sincere romantic affection like sealing wax that subtly reeked of frankincense, while simultaneously carrying the weighty symbolism of parental expectations pressed into warm wax. This practice preserved both the delicate scent and the indelible mark of family honor for future generations. As this trend blossomed, professional aromatics consultants began offering their bespoke services to affluent families. They provided expert advice on optimal scent combinations tailored for different types of correspondence. These specialists possessed a nuanced understanding that the delicate art of marriage negotiations required distinctly different aromatic approaches than, say, a casual expression of romantic interest. They also understood that varying social classes expected different levels of olfactory sophistication in their communications, reflecting subtle social distinctions. Some particularly enterprising individuals established dedicated scent libraries, where discerning clients could sample various aromatic combinations before making their final, crucial decisions about their romantic correspondence. These novel establishments quickly evolved into vibrant social gathering places, becoming hubs where invaluable information about successful aromatic strategies was exchanged. Here, eager newcomers could learn the intricate and often complex rules governing medieval romantic fragrance etiquette, a true art form in itself. However, this practice also inadvertently created fertile ground for sabotage and romantic warfare. Rival suitors might actively attempt to discover their competitors' aromatic strategies, then either brazenly copy them or, more cunningly, deliberately choose conflicting scents. The goal was to create unpleasant, clashing aromatic combinations if the letters were stored together, spoiling the intended romantic mood. Some individuals went to even greater lengths, resorting to bribing servants to secretly tamper with their rivals' correspondence, adding inappropriate or outright offensive scents that would effectively destroy any burgeoning romantic prospects, turning a subtle art into a weapon. Modern dating customs might involve presenting a carefully curated bouquet of flowers, a box of artisanal chocolates, or thoughtfully compiled musical playlists designed to showcase sophisticated artistic taste. Perhaps a well-chosen gift demonstrates a nuanced understanding of your beloved's personal interests and preferences. Medieval European romantic tradition, however, favored an entirely different, perhaps startling approach, offering recently deceased woodland creatures as irrefutable proof of masculine capability, exceptional hunting prowess, and undeniably excellent aim with various sharp projectiles. Knights and noble gentlemen frequently presented their romantic interests with fresh spoils from successful hunting expeditions. This was because nothing communicated the essential message: "I think about you constantly while engaged in mortal combat with dangerous forest animals," quite like delivering a freshly killed boar's head that was still steaming slightly in the cool morning air. The presence of authentic bloodstains served as undeniable proof of your martial achievement and hunting skill. A bouquet of roses, while a pleasant aesthetic gesture demonstrating access to gardens or flower markets, simply couldn't convey the same message. Roses couldn't demonstrate your ability to provide sustenance for a growing family, to stalwartly defend territorial boundaries against hostile neighbors, or to successfully navigate the complex political landscape of medieval forest management and hunting rights negotiation with competing aristocratic families who might vigorously challenge your territorial claims. This practice, while perhaps disturbing to modern sensibilities, was not considered unusual, disturbing, or inappropriate by contemporary social standards. Medieval romantic literature actively encouraged hunting gifts as compelling demonstrations of masculine worthiness and practical capability, qualities that were directly translatable into a successful marriage and effective family leadership. According to 14th century chivalric tradition, a gentleman's hunting ability was seen as a direct reflection of his suitability as a potential husband, a capable father, and a stalwart protector of family interests against both human adversaries and animal threats. If you could successfully chase down a full-grown stag through dense forest terrain, then physically wrestle it into submission through superior physical strength and tactical planning, and finally present its magnificent antlers on an expensive silver platter without getting seriously injured, permanently disabled, or accidentally starting a costly territorial dispute with neighboring hunters, you essentially represented the medieval equivalent of a romantic leading man. Such an individual possessed impeccable provider credentials and impressively demonstrated risk management skills, making him a highly desirable match. Women were culturally expected to respond to these presentations with enthusiastic gratitude and carefully practiced expressions of feminine admiration, even if they were privately calculating optimal storage solutions for their third deer carcass of the current week, and wondering whether their suitor truly understood that venison required very specific preparation techniques to avoid rapid spoilage during seasonal temperature fluctuations. The intense social pressure to appear profoundly grateful for such hunting gifts created elaborate performance requirements for the recipients. Ladies needed to demonstrate appropriate levels of amazement at their suitor's prowess and skill, while simultaneously showing a comprehensive knowledge of proper meat preservation techniques, various cooking methods, and essential household management skills that would convincingly prove their worthiness as potential wives, capable of efficiently managing the demanding domestic aspects of married life. Certain animal gifts carried particular symbolic significance that added complex layers of romantic meaning to otherwise straightforward presentations of dead wildlife. Swans, with their elegant white plumage, ostensibly represented purity, grace, and refined aesthetic sensibility, assuming, of course, that they hadn't injured anyone during the capture process, which was unfortunately quite common since swans possessed essentially demonic temperaments often disguised as elegant white plumage and had been known to break human bones with their powerful wings. Falcons were closely associated with nobility, elevated power, and aristocratic leisure activities, making them highly popular gifts among wealthy social circles who could readily afford the extensive equipment and professional training required for proper falconry. However, they demanded constant professional feeding, specialized training by qualified experts, and had unfortunate tendencies to bite their new owner's fingers with surprising force and accuracy, which somewhat diminished their romantic appeal. During practical daily interaction, turning a symbol of power into a source of minor pain. Less financially advantaged suitors sometimes resorted to presenting smaller prey that reflected both their economic limitations and their more modest available hunting skills. Hedgehogs, ferrets, and rabbits became common romantic tokens among ambitious but resource-constrained lovers who couldn't afford to hunt anything larger than their personal enthusiasm and basic equipment could safely handle without professional assistance or expensive specialized gear. The symbolic meaning of these smaller game animals was often carefully negotiated and creatively interpreted to maintain romantic significance despite their obvious size limitations. A well-presented rabbit, for instance, could subtly represent domestic harmony and abundant fertility, while hedgehogs might symbolize protective devotion and the unique ability to defend one's beloved against threats through clever defensive strategies rather than aggressive confrontation, appealing to a different kind of strength. One particularly memorable historical incident involved a lovesick baker who, in a misguided attempt, tried to impress a miller's daughter by confidently presenting her with what he genuinely believed was a romantically appropriate duck. Unfortunately, the living gift immediately and unexpectedly escaped into her family's primary water well, contaminating their essential water source and subsequently requiring expensive professional well cleaning services. This rather disastrous event effectively terminated the relationship before it could even develop beyond the initial ill-fated romantic gesture stage. The incident quickly became a cautionary tale told throughout the region, emphasizing the critical importance of proper animal handling, meticulous gift presentation planning, and a thorough understanding of the practical, often unforeseen, consequences of romantic gestures that involved living creatures capable of independent action and, regrettably, significant property damage. The absolute pinnacle of medieval romantic animal presentation involved the grand ceremonial deer offering, an elaborate public ritual where a successful knight would present an entire roasted deer at a formal banquet, specifically organized to honor his chosen lady. This spectacular event required extensive musical accompaniment, formal speeches eulogizing the heroic aspects of the hunt, professional catering services, and approximately 50 additional guests, who all tacitly agreed to pretend this wasn't the most socially awkward dinner party they had ever attended. The ceremony itself required incredibly careful choreography to meticulously avoid potential disasters involving hot venison, formal clothing, sharp carving implements, and the complex social dynamics of public romantic displays witnessed by extended family members, crucial political allies, and omnipresent potential rivals who might ruthlessly use any misstep for their own strategic advantage. Success hinged entirely on the lady's ability to appear genuinely and graciously surprised by a gift that had evidently required weeks of meticulous planning, professional hunting assistance, elaborate catering arrangements, and precise coordination. With local musicians who specialized in dinner entertainment that both complemented large dead animals and avoided creating inappropriate humor or inadvertently undermining the carefully cultivated romantic atmosphere, the profound ceremonial aspect meant that every minute element of the presentation carried significant symbolic weight that could be interpreted by astute observing guests as compelling evidence of the suitor's character, his personal resources, his valuable family connections, and his overall long-term romantic prospects. A poorly executed deer presentation could inflict damage not only on immediate romantic prospects, but also on broader social reputation and crucial political standing within the community, making it a high-stakes endeavor. Medieval romantic tradition fundamentally assumed that recipients genuinely enjoyed consuming meat products and possessed sufficient kitchen facilities, practical cooking knowledge, and ample storage capacity to efficiently process large animal carcasses into edible meals for their households. If your intended beloved, by unfortunate chance, followed vegetarian dietary practices, whether by personal choice, medical necessity, deep religious conviction, or simply a profound squeamishness regarding blood and butchering processes, your carefully planned romantic gesture could spectacularly backfire with significant social consequences that extended far beyond immediate disappointment, potentially making you the subject of ridicule. Historical records meticulously document instances where thoughtful hunting gifts caused genuine psychological trauma, leading to immediate relationship termination, and even to extremely awkward, lengthy conversations with local religious authorities about the profound spiritual implications of romantic violence directed against innocent woodland creatures who had committed no crimes beyond merely existing in forests where ambitious suitors might happen to encounter them. Some particularly sensitive individuals developed lasting, visceral aversions to their suitors, based solely on these hunting gift presentations, associating potential romantic partners not with admirable qualities like protection, provision, and masculine capability, but rather with raw violence, pervasive blood, and inevitable death. These profound and often unexpected responses created complex, challenging social situations where what were undoubtedly well-intentioned romantic gestures produced effects precisely opposite from those explicitly intended, leading to romantic failures. In a world utterly lacking modern dating applications, convenient casual coffee meeting locations, carefully designed social spaces intended to facilitate low-pressure romantic encounters, or professional matchmaking services, presenting a dead animal wrapped in decorative ribbon communicated several important, simultaneous messages to potential partners, conveying intent and capability in a direct, albeit brutal, manner. The razor-sharp blade sliced through the pale moonlight as Lady Margaret crept stealthily through the castle's oppressive shadows, clutching a single, blood-stained letter that possessed the power to utterly destroy 3 kingdoms. Behind her, heavy footsteps echoed ominously in the cold, stone corridors. The unmistakable sounds of her father's men, relentlessly hunting for the damning evidence that would either miraculously save her lover's life or mercilessly condemn them both to the grim executioner's block. She had precisely 3 minutes to reach the towering fortress before the midnight bells tolled, irrevocably sealing Sir Edmund's tragic fate forever. But this was no mere tale of modern espionage or a dramatic wartime romance. This was a typical Tuesday night in medieval Europe, where the very act of love was quite literally a matter of life and death, and the pursuit of romance required the meticulous, strategic planning of a full-scale military campaign. Welcome, then, to a bewildering world where your romantic success was intricately dependent on the alignment of astrological charts, the liberal application of pork fat, and, on occasion, a desperate duel to the death over a misplaced jewel. A world where merely complimenting someone's shoes could inexplicably lead to immediate marriage proposals, and looking at a woman for too long might swiftly result in challenging her entire family to mortal combat. Before you settle in for this extraordinary journey through history's most baffling and often brutal customs, understand this. Medieval romance made even the most complicated modern dating scenarios look like utterly childish play. So, dim those lights, perhaps activate that soft, reassuring background fan, and prepare yourself for an immersive journey into a world where aromatic herbs were potent weapons of seduction. The recitation of certain poetry could get you excommunicated from the church, and the wrong kind of eye contact might, quite literally, ignite a full-blown war between neighboring villages, leading to widespread bloodshed. In the realm of modern romance, we are constantly told that sustained eye contact builds crucial connection, fosters deep trust, and cultivates intimate understanding between potential partners, forming the bedrock of meaningful relationships. In stark contrast, medieval Europe viewed prolonged gazing as an act that quickly built suspicion, initiated formal engagement contracts, led to exorbitantly expensive lawsuits, and occasionally even sparked small-scale wars between powerful families, who simply could not agree on whether a specific glance constituted a legitimate marriage proposal or a grave act of war against their daughter's sacred virtue. The deceptively simple act of merely looking at someone you found attractive required more meticulous strategic planning than most complex modern military operations. Courtship manuals of the era frequently warned that improper visual contact could swiftly lead to excommunication from the church, widespread public scandal that would ruin reputations, or the terrifying prospect of accidentally binding yourself in holy matrimony to someone whose name you didn't even know, a truly irrevocable social blunder. Medieval courtship often commenced with what rigorous etiquette guides euphemistically called the look, which was decidedly not a casual, fleeting glance across a bustling marketplace, but rather a carefully timed, morally calibrated visual exchange that demanded the precision of a master archer and the nuanced diplomatic skills of an international ambassador. The timing of this gaze had to be absolutely perfect, its duration exactly calculated, and its intensity carefully modulated to convey sufficient interest without ever suggesting impropriety or illicit intent. If the gaze was too brief, you risked appearing entirely uninterested, possibly visually impaired, or even suffering from one of the various eye diseases that regularly swept through medieval communities like unwelcome, debilitating houseguests. Conversely, if the gaze lingered for too long, you were essentially making a public announcement of your unequivocal intention to marry this person, to forcefully invade their family's ancestral property, or to challenge their male relatives to formal combat over disputed territorial rights and perceived reproductive privileges, a truly grave escalation. The widely circulated Manual of Proper Courtly Gazing, reputedly authored by an anonymous monk who clearly possessed extensive first-hand experience with romantic disasters, and probably spent an inordinate amount of time covertly observing human behavior from his secluded monastery window, wisely advised men to gaze softly yet sincerely, with the profound devotion of morning prayer, but simultaneously with the rigorous restraint of a man who values both his immortal soul and his fragile physical extremities. The universally ideal stare, according to this influential text, fell somewhere between the subtle message of "I deeply admire your exquisite needlework skills and impeccable moral character," and the crucial, reassuring declaration of "I am definitely not planning to kidnap you or illicitly steal your family's valuable livestock during the upcoming harvest season," a necessary clarification of intent. One particularly influential guidebook, which circulated virally through European courts like a medieval dating manual, issued a stern warning to male readers to strictly avoid what it meticulously termed lingering stares of the sort that cause blushing in virtuous maidens, which presented immediate and intricate complications. This was because blushing, a complex physiological response, could be triggered by a multitude of factors, including the pervasive wind, excessive consumption of wine, seasonal fevers, profound embarrassment, sudden surges of anger, religious ecstasy, or, indeed, having contracted any of the 15 different aggressively circulating plagues currently sweeping through the European population, like particularly aggressive, fatal party invitations that nobody, understandably, wanted to receive. If, during your meticulously calibrated gaze, a lady happened to turn pink, medieval social protocol rigorously demanded that you immediately avert your eyes with haste, cross yourself with appropriate religious fervor to ward off scandal, and quite possibly flee discreetly to the next county, remaining there until the potential scandal had time to die down, or, more favorably, be conveniently replaced by more interesting, juicy gossip involving someone else's romantic disasters, diverting unwanted attention. The formidable Catholic Church, which maintained strong and often inflexible opinions about virtually every conceivable aspect of human behavior, ranging from the most mundane breakfast consumption to the most intimate bedtime prayers, held particularly firm and unwavering views on the perilous act of romantic gazing. Priests routinely delivered lengthy, impassioned sermons warning their congregations that excessive eye contact, in their view, dangerously opened the vulnerable soul to temptation, spiritual corruption, and quite possibly even gout, which they earnestly believed was caused by inherent moral weakness and woefully inadequate prayer schedules. They adamantly preached that proper Christian affection should arise purely from pious admiration of one's moral character and unblemished virtue, rather than from what church authorities disdainfully termed eye flirtation, a phrase that, in retrospect, sounds considerably more exciting and daring than it actually was in practice, given the strictures. Church doctrine vigorously encouraged unmarried couples to keep their conversations notably brief, their physical distance substantially vast, and their collective gaze appropriately focused on the ground where, in their theological opinion, it rightfully belonged, along with their earthly expectations of personal happiness and any semblance of autonomy in romantic matters. The Church firmly believed that romantic love, in its raw, unfiltered form, constituted a dangerous and potentially destructive distraction from paramount spiritual obligations, and they had, over centuries, meticulously developed elaborate theological arguments to staunchly support this conservative position. If two individuals accidentally locked eyes during solemn religious services, and by accidentally, the vigilant ecclesiastical authorities strictly meant any fleeting eye contact lasting longer than the prescribed half-second of polite, barely discernible acknowledgement. It was instantly considered a major scandal requiring immediate forceful intervention by multiple priests, concerned and often outraged family members, and quite possibly even the formidable local bishop if the situation appeared particularly threatening to the sacrosanct community moral standards. The unfortunate souls involved in such a transgression might as well have publicly announced their scandalous engagement to the entire horrified congregation, or been discovered sharing intimate quarters in blatant defiance of public decency, because the social consequences were, for all practical purposes, virtually identical and equally catastrophic for their reputations and any future respectable marriage prospects. For noble women, in particular, the subtle act of eye contact represented an incredibly complex and fraught battlefield where a single, innocent yet misinterpreted glance could irrevocably destroy meticulously negotiated marriage alliances, mercilessly trigger devastating blood feuds between powerful, rival families, or inadvertently commit them to socially disastrous relationships with completely inappropriate partners who sorely lacked sufficient land ownership, vital political connections, or the kind of distinguished family background that would satisfy their ambitious parents' exacting social aspirations. Women of aristocratic status, therefore, received extensive and rigorous training from early childhood in maintaining what highly influential etiquette manuals termed the courtly look, a carefully cultivated facial expression that managed to be simultaneously utterly expressionless, emotionally distant, and subtly, mildly bored, as if they were perpetually contemplating the intricate theological implications of breakfast preparation, or the proper, highly organized structure of their personal prayer schedule, a masterclass in controlled neutrality. This demanding training was considered an absolutely essential component of a young lady's education, deemed as critically important as learning to read Latin or efficiently managing complex household accounts. Professional tutors specifically specialized in teaching the subtle and nuanced art of appearing completely uninterested, while simultaneously communicating a carefully veiled availability for appropriate courtship from suitable partners who meticulously met their family's strict and often unforgiving criteria for social acceptability. A seemingly innocent, wandering glance from a lady could be, with terrifying ease, interpreted as profound romantic interest, evidence of witchcraft, a sign of severe indigestion, secret communication with hostile enemy agents, undeniable evidence of mental instability requiring immediate and brutal medical intervention by qualified practitioners of medieval psychology, or, most terrifyingly, overt signs of demonic possession that might necessitate a full-blown exorcism performed by trained religious authorities, underscoring the extreme risks of misinterpretation. The inherent complexity of visual communication meant that noble families often wisely employed professional interpreters who specialized exclusively in decoding the subtle meaning of glances, fleeting expressions, and minute facial movements. These highly skilled experts could meticulously analyze a single brief look and subsequently provide detailed, insightful reports about potential romantic intentions, intricate political implications, and expertly recommended responses that would both staunchly protect family honor and strategically advance crucial social interests. Despite these formidable restrictions and the constant chilling threat of widespread social catastrophe, people somehow, miraculously, managed to develop genuine romantic connections across vast, echoing banquet halls, through muddy market squares, and within the solemn confines of church courtyards. The very inherent difficulty of communication, paradoxically, made every successful, fleeting interaction feel like a remarkable and hard-won achievement, truly worthy of grand celebration and meticulous, detailed documentation in treasured family chronicles. Lovers, driven by their intense, burgeoning emotions, composed elaborate and often fervent poetry about fleeting, stolen glances lasting merely half a heartbeat, treating these brief, intimate moments as sacred, almost divine experiences that deserved artistic immortality, forever etched in verse. Traveling troubadours, the minstrels of medieval romance, sang passionate ballads about eyes that pierced the soul like arrows of celestial fire, which was, in essence, medieval romantic language, for looked at me slightly longer than current. Social regulations technically permitted, and I have been thinking about it constantly and obsessively ever since, highlighting the profound impact of even the slightest deviation from strict social norms. The supreme irony, a profound paradox, was that by attempting to meticulously prevent improper romantic connections through the exceedingly strict regulation of visual contact, medieval society had inadvertently made every fleeting glance so profoundly loaded with potential meaning that a simple, unadorned look carried more intense emotional significance and communicative weight than modern couples typically achieve after months of incessant text messaging, carefully curated social media interaction, and extensive online dating conversations. When merely looking at someone could, with terrifying ease, utterly destroy your hard-won reputation, irrevocably ruin crucial political alliances, or fundamentally and permanently alter your entire life's trajectory, every shared gaze, however, brief, truly became a small, daring adventure. Every singular moment of direct eye contact, a minor yet profound revolution against the overwhelming forces of social control and rigid romantic regulation that governed medieval society with an iron, unforgiving discipline. Sir Geoffrey learned this harsh lesson the hard way when he made the seemingly innocent mistake of admiring Lady Eleanor's elegant posture for what he meticulously calculated was a perfectly safe 3 seconds during Sunday morning Mass. What he, in his naivete, didn't realize was that her influential father had already, and secretly, promised her hand in marriage to the formidable Earl of Blackmore. That the Earl, a man of considerable suspicion, maintained an extensive network of highly trained spies specifically designed to identify and neutralize any potential romantic rivals. And that Lady Eleanor herself had been desperately attempting to capture Geoffrey's attention for months, employing the subtle, almost imperceptible, art of strategic positioning and carefully timed adjustments of her prayer book to catch his eye. 3 seconds of unintended eye contact during a solemn religious service. One single fleeting heartbeat of mutual, albeit accidental, recognition. Half the entire village, sensing an impending scandal, ready for armed conflict. Such was the astonishing power of visual communication in the Middle Ages, an era where romance wasn't just merely complicated, it was potentially fatal for everyone involved, a true high-stakes game. Medieval Europeans fundamentally understood that personal hygiene was critically important for romantic success. But their approach to achieving appealing aromas was considerably different from modern strategies involving mass-produced commercial products and a scientific understanding of complex chemistry. In an era utterly devoid of mass-produced deodorants, sophisticated colognes, or even basic soap accessibility for the vast majority of social classes, creative and ambitious individuals ingeniously turned to nature's vast pharmacy for solutions to the eternal, perplexing challenge of smelling genuinely attractive to potential romantic partners. Medieval advice literature adamantly insisted that romantic success hinged entirely on whether you managed to emit the correct, pleasing herbal fragrances rather than the far more common medieval alternatives, which typically involved close, unavoidable association with farm animals, the pervasive stench of open sewage systems, the distinct odor of unwashed clothing, and your own body's natural, unavoidable processes that modern people, understandably, prefer to disguise or eliminate entirely. The grim reality of medieval body odor was genuinely challenging and pervasive. Most people bathed perhaps only twice per year, if they were fortunate enough to have access to warm water and even basic private bathing facilities. Clothing was rarely, if ever, washed, since soap was exorbitantly expensive and primitive washing techniques were vastly inferior by modern standards. The cumulative result was a population that carried distinctive, often strong, personal aromas, each reflecting their daily activities, their specific dietary choices, and their general approach to personal hygiene, a true olfactory tapestry of medieval life. Herbs, therefore, became the medieval equivalent of modern perfume, though the often fine line between pleasantly aromatic and smells like someone tragically fell face first into an apothecary's garden and decided to make it their permanent residence was frequently and enthusiastically crossed by zealous practitioners of botanical seduction. The prevailing theory held that certain carefully selected plant-based scents could both effectively mask unfortunate bodily odors and, more importantly, actively attract romantic interest through mysterious processes that combined ancient folk, wisdom, deeply held religious belief, optimistic, wishful thinking, and, more often than not, desperate, fervent hope. Common romantic advice widely suggested that ambitious suitors should discreetly tuck fresh sprigs of fragrant rosemary, pungent sage, or soothing lavender into their sleeves, inside their boots, within belt pouches, under hat brims, or any other article of clothing capable of concealing vegetation without creating obvious, suspicious bulges or unusual rustling sounds that might prematurely alert potential romantic targets to their subtly deployed aromatic strategies. Every time they subtly walked past their intended target, they would, in theory, leave behind a delicate, tantalizing trail of floral mystery that proudly announced their presence like a mobile advertisement for their romantic suitability, their commendable basic personal hygiene efforts, and, crucially, their access to well-maintained gardens or markets where fresh herbs could be obtained at reasonable, affordable prices. Did this actually mask the pervasive reality of medieval body odor, which typically combined, with unsettling precision, elements of worn leather, various animal products, acrid wood smoke, unwashed wool, pungent fermented beverages, and an assortment of various biological processes that modern people generally prefer not to discuss in polite company? Not particularly effectively by modern standards. However, it demonstrably showcased effort, creativity, resourcefulness, and, importantly, access to valuable resources, all of which constituted significant romantic advantages in a world where most people genuinely smelled like they had been thoroughly marinated in barnyard essence for several consecutive seasons. Wealthier individuals, enjoying greater economic freedom, could proudly afford elaborate pomanders, decorative, often intricately perforated metal balls filled with expensive exotic herbs, rare imported spices, and sometimes even dried citrus fruits that had miraculously traveled thousands of miles to reach European markets. These luxurious items conspicuously hung from ornate chains attached to their belts, swaying dramatically and audibly during movement and broadcasting the unmistakable, powerful message of, "I possess sufficient financial resources to effortlessly purchase extravagant aromatic accessories," suggesting I might be genuinely capable of providing for a family's basic needs and possibly even satisfying their sophisticated wants. A clear sign of status and potential. The gentle, melodic jingling sound created by the swinging pomander chains also served as an early, almost musical warning system, allowing ladies sufficient precious time to meticulously compose their features into appropriate expressions of courtly interest before the bearer of these pleasant scents arrived within comfortable conversation range. This strategic advantage gave both parties ample opportunity to prepare themselves for social interaction according to the established, intricate protocols of romantic engagement, minimizing awkwardness. Women enthusiastically participated in this pervasive aromatic competition by carrying delicately scented sachets of dried herbs, discreetly tucked into their corsets, artfully sewn into their sleeves, woven into their elaborate hair arrangements, or even cunningly sewn into the hems of their gowns where the subtle scents would be gradually released through movement and body heat. These sachets served multiple practical purposes, significantly improving their personal fragrance, demonstrating their nuanced knowledge of herbal properties and their admirable domestic skills, and importantly, actively repelling the various bothersome insects that found unwashed medieval bodies irresistibly attractive, providing some much-needed relief. Romance, surprisingly, was considerably easier to manage and cultivate when neither party was constantly scratching incessant flea bites, frantically swatting away persistent flies attracted to their personal aromatic atmosphere, or dealing with the myriad other pest-related distractions that could easily interrupt intimate conversations or formal courtship activities, making aromatic efforts a pragmatic concern for comfort and romance. More adventurous practitioners, driven by a blend of hope and desperation, applied herbs directly to their skin, firmly believing that different plants possessed mystical properties that could influence both their inherent attractiveness and their romantic prospects through enigmatic processes that medieval science couldn't definitively explain, but nevertheless staunchly supported through extensive anecdotal evidence and deeply ingrained religious conviction. Basil was widely supposed to inspire boldness and courage in potential suitors, thereby encouraging them to make direct, unequivocal romantic overtures rather than lingering indefinitely in the agonizing preliminary stages of courtship, painstakingly building their courage through prayer and prodigious alcohol consumption. Mint, with its fresh, invigorating scent, promised a sense of cleanliness and freshness that might miraculously survive morning prayers, basic physical activity, and the inherent stress of romantic interaction without completely overwhelming potential partners with unfortunate biological realities that were best left unacknowledged. Marjoram, a softer, sweeter herb, was widely believed to soften the hearts of particularly stubborn or resistant romantic targets who might be hesitating due to intense family pressure, profound religious concerns, or simply a fundamental lack of interest in the applicant's personal qualities and precarious marriage prospects. One particularly influential 13th century romantic manual made the startling and rather enigmatic claim that thyme, when vigorously rubbed directly onto the chest area, makes the heart visible to those who would love truly. This declaration represents either a profound poetic symbolism about emotional transparency and vulnerability, or, more disturbingly, a potential recipe for mysterious medical complications that medieval physicians were woefully ill-equipped to address properly. Leaving the matter open to historical medical debate, medieval apothecaries conducted thriving and lucrative businesses selling specialized romantic aromatics, marketing secret herbal blends that allegedly guaranteed irresistible attraction to members of the opposite sex. These enigmatic products came with elaborate, often fabricated testimonials from supposedly satisfied customers and grand promises of romantic success that were approximately as reliable as medieval weather forecasting, but considerably more expensive and potentially disastrous to your hard-won social reputation if their use was ever discovered by disapproving parties. Results varied dramatically depending on a complex interplay of factors: application techniques, the individual's unique body chemistry, the seasonal availability of specific ingredients, and, crucially, the recipient's personal tolerance for such. bold botanical experimentation. Documented side effects, often humorous in retrospect, included uncontrollable sneezing fits during crucial romantic moments, widespread confusion among local farm animals who inexplicably began following heavily perfumed customers around in the misguided hope of being fed, and occasional unfortunate cases of mistaken identity, where heavily perfumed individuals were confused with traveling spice merchants or disreputable practitioners of folk medicine, leading to awkward encounters. Not all medieval scents, however, carried universally positive romantic connotations or reliably improved your chances with potential partners. Garlic, for instance, while readily available and remarkably affordable for most social classes, sent frustratingly mixed signals that could significantly complicate courtship efforts in unexpected ways. While its use demonstrated vitality and suggested access to food beyond basic bread rations, it also simultaneously created strong, often overwhelming personal aromas that some potential partners found off-putting or distinctly reminiscent of. Individuals who spent excessive amounts of time working in damp, earthy root vegetable storage facilities. If your breath carried the distinctive, unmistakable fragrance of beer and preserved fish, this wasn't necessarily considered a romantic failure. It simply indicated normal Tuesday evening dining habits in most medieval communities, where fresh food was strictly seasonal and preservation techniques relied heavily on salt, fermentation, various smoking processes, and optimistic prayer that nothing would spoil before consumption, a culinary reality. Wealthier individuals, by contrast, could afford to indulge in exotic imported luxuries like delicate rosewater, rare and potent musk, and incredibly expensive spices that, astonishingly, cost more than most entire families earned during entire agricultural seasons. These weren't merely pleasant fragrances. They functioned as potent, overt status symbols that loudly announced the wearer's formidable economic viability as a potential marriage partner and their impressive ability to provide exquisite imported luxuries for their future household, a clear display of wealth and potential. The most ambitious practitioners developed elaborate, bespoke personal scent profiles that subtly reflected their unique personality, their elevated social status, and their specific romantic objectives. These sophisticated profiles might combine multiple local herbs with precious imported spices, meticulously creating unique signature aromas that would be vividly remembered long after any social encounters had gracefully ended. The ultimate goal was to become so distinctively and memorably fragrant that potential romantic partners would immediately and involuntarily think of you whenever they encountered similar scents in their daily lives, creating a powerful olfactory association. Professional perfumers, a burgeoning elite, began offering specialized consultation services to their wealthy clientele, advising them on optimal scent combinations tailored for different seasons, specific social events, and diverse romantic objectives. These highly specialized experts could meticulously create custom blends designed to attract very specific types of partners or to subtly convey particular nuanced messages about the wearer's character and intentions, turning fragrance into a form of nonverbal communication. The proliferation of this practice led to an increasingly sophisticated and nuanced understanding of how different aromas subtly affected human behavior and emotional responses. Medieval practitioners, through empirical observation, discovered that certain precise scent combinations could remarkably influence mood, memory, and social perception in ways that gave skilled users significant, often unacknowledged advantages in fierce romantic competition. Some particularly determined and superstitious individuals even meticulously coordinated their aromatic strategies with lunar cycles and astrological timing, earnestly believing that different herbs were inherently more effective during specific phases of the moon or during auspicious planetary alignments. This required maintaining detailed astrological charts and painstakingly planning romantic encounters around cosmic events, thereby transforming the art of seduction into something resembling an elaborate combination of agricultural science and observational astronomy, blending the mystical with the practical. Medieval poetry, far from being merely artistic expression or literary entertainment, functioned as a highly sophisticated and versatile romantic communication system. This was particularly valuable for socially awkward nobles, who, despite their lack of interpersonal charm, possessed greater access to expensive writing materials than they did to actual, impressive conversation skills capable of genuinely captivating potential romantic partners without inadvertently causing immediate social scandal. The most fascinating aspect of medieval romantic poetry wasn't necessarily its elaborate metaphors, its complex rhyme schemes, or its sophisticated literary techniques, but rather the strict, often rigid, religious requirements that governed acceptable content and directly determined whether your artistic expression would be widely celebrated and admired, or, conversely, result in swift and devastating excommunication proceedings, marking the boundaries of permissible romantic expression. The most socially appropriate and accepted method of expressing romantic affection in medieval Europe did not, surprisingly, involve praising your beloved's physical beauty, acknowledging their intellectual capabilities, admiring their engaging personality traits, or any of the actual qualities that genuinely made them attractive to you in the first place. Such direct, worldly appreciation was considered inherently sinful, dangerously likely to inspire inappropriate carnal thoughts in both the writer and the reader, which could ultimately lead to moral corruption, spiritual damnation, and various other undesirable consequences in the afterlife. Instead, aspiring romantic poets were rigorously and unequivocally encouraged to compare their intended beloved to divine religious figures, with the Virgin Mary representing the absolute gold standard of appropriate and safe romantic comparison. Nothing announced your intention to pursue a modest, spiritually acceptable courtship, quite like solemnly informing someone that they reminded you of the Holy Mother of God, a comparison that was simultaneously theologically safe and profoundly romantically confusing, leaving much to interpretation. This stringent requirement created a uniquely challenging and often absurd literary genre that desperately attempted to balance sincere romantic expression with unyielding religious orthodoxy, producing poetry that walked an incredibly narrow and perilous line between acceptable courtly entertainment and potentially heretical romantic blasphemy, which could very well result in serious legal and ecclesiastical consequences for the author. Courtly love poems, under these strictures, became as much theological exercises as they were romantic declarations, meticulously designed to satisfy vigilant church authorities who viewed any form of unauthorized romantic expression with the same fervent enthusiasm they typically reserved for disliked activities like tax collection, boisterous public dancing, and other perceived threats to social order and spiritual purity. The peculiar result was a body of romantic literature that praised everything about the beloved, except the very qualities that actually made her genuinely attractive to the writer. A typical medieval love poem might include verses like, "O Lady, purest of heart and morning light, thy gaze more sacred than any holy rite," which sounds superficially beautiful and romantic until you grasp the underlying reality that the author is essentially comparing his romantic interest to mundane baptismal font water, or, less romantically, to sacred communion bread, a rather abstract appreciation. This trend produced an entire poetic movement based on systematic romantic confusion, where astute readers could never quite determine with certainty whether they were examining genuine love letters intended for courtship or profound religious material suitable for inclusion in Sunday morning worship services. The boundary between romantic poetry and devotional literature became so profoundly blurred that some sophisticated compositions deliberately served both purposes simultaneously, cleverly allowing nervous authors to claim their work was primarily intended for spiritual meditation if ever questioned by suspicious religious authorities. One particularly famous medieval poem, a classic example of this genre, referred to the beloved as "my angel of chaste delight and virtuous inspiration," which represents precisely the kind of ambiguous description that would result in confused responses even in the 12th century. Women receiving such elaborate, religiously charged comparisons must have genuinely wondered whether their suitor's ultimate desire was to marry them, to worship them as saints, to subtly encourage them to join convents and pursue lives of rigorous religious dedication, or simply, more pragmatically, couldn't think of any secular metaphors that wouldn't immediately get them into severe trouble with omnipresent church authorities. Many wealthy nobles, recognizing their own lack of poetic finesse and the inherent risks, wisely hired professional troubadours to compose romantic poetry on their behalf, understanding that these specialized bards possessed superior skills in crafting verses that successfully navigated the complex requirements of medieval romantic expression without accidentally committing heresy or inadvertently insulting powerful aristocratic families. These professional poets specialized in developing elaborate metaphorical structures that could be artfully interpreted as either sincere romantic interest or profound spiritual devotion, depending entirely on the reader's perspective, the current, delicate political climate, and the practical necessity of maintaining plausible deniability if circumstances changed unexpectedly or unfavorably. If your personally commissioned love song, despite all precautions, caused widespread social scandal or attracted unwanted, probing attention from zealous religious authorities, you could always, as a convenient fallback, claim it was originally intended for a fictional nun you had never actually met, who conveniently lived in a distant convent you couldn't precisely locate on any available map, in a foreign country you had never personally visited, and thus couldn't accurately describe to. Investigating officials providing perfect alibi, professional troubadours, through this intricate dance of words, became undisputed masters of the delicate art of expressing romantic interest without actually explicitly expressing it, creating sophisticated poetic codes that often required advanced theological education to decode properly. A typical commission might produce elaborate compositions that, in essence, communicated the complex message. I find you romantically appealing, but I'm absolutely terrified of your father's inevitable reaction, the overwhelming church disapproval, the terrifying possibility of eternal damnation, and the intricate social consequences of expressing any unauthorized romantic feelings. A truly comprehensive list of medieval anxieties. These meticulously crafted songs often represented approximately 27 stanzas of polite, verbose evasion, essentially communicating, I humbly admire your virtue from a perfectly safe distance, while meticulously maintaining complete spiritual and legal deniability regarding any inappropriate romantic implications that might, however, unfairly be inferred from this artistic expression by individuals with suspicious minds or ulterior political agendas. The most successful troubadours developed formidable reputations for creating poetry so ingeniously and subtly ambiguous that the very same composition could seamlessly serve as courtly entertainment, a deeply spiritual meditation, or a cleverly coded romantic communication, depending entirely on the audience's interpretation, their current social context, and the pressing political necessity for maintaining different public positions. Women, in a refreshing contrast, occasionally responded to these elaborate poetic overtures with poetry of their own, and their verses often demonstrated a remarkably practical honesty compared to the elaborate religious acrobatics performed by their male counterparts. A lady, cutting directly to the chase, might compose something refreshingly straightforward like, I admire your courage, your courteous manners, and particularly the undeniable fact that you possess substantial land holdings, healthy livestock, and influential family connections that would undoubtedly benefit our potential future children. This not only represented far more direct and practical communication, but also demonstrated a superior, grounded understanding of medieval marriage, economics that the troubadours' elaborate metaphorical structures completely failed to address, highlighting the pragmatic realities of noble unions. The medieval romantic, driven by an intense desire for success, reached directly for specialized spice collections with the determined focus of someone whose romantic future depended entirely on aromatic success. They understood implicitly that failure to properly scent their correspondence could result in immediate dismissal from consideration by discerning recipients with multiple suitors competing for their attention. Cinnamon served as the premium standard for passionate correspondence, immediately representing warmth, exotic luxury, and expensive taste. Its inclusion subtly suggested that the writer possessed both valuable international trading connections and sufficient wealth to waste valuable spices on romantic gestures, rather than selling them for profit like sensible merchants. Cloves indicated serious devotion and long-term romantic commitment, suggesting the writer was prepared for extended courtship periods, formal marriage negotiations, and permanent relationship arrangements that would meticulously satisfy both families' complex social and economic requirements. Rose petals communicated refined aesthetic appreciation and a gentle romantic sensibility that particularly appealed to ladies who valued cultural sophistication over crude, overt demonstrations of masculine aggression. Ground nutmeg was strictly reserved for particularly ambitious suitors, attempting to impress recipients with delicate sensory preferences and a connoisseur's appreciation for rare imported luxuries that cost more than most families earned during entire agricultural seasons, a true display of extravagant taste. According to established courtly customs, these aromatic additions weren't merely decorative touches or pleasant aesthetic enhancements designed to make correspondence more appealing. Crucially, the spices carried specific symbolic meanings that recipients were expected to interpret like sophisticated romantic fortune-telling systems, requiring specialized cultural education to properly decode. Saffron, for instance, earned particular recognition because its extraordinary expense could, quite literally, bankrupt small villages. This made it the perfect choice for communicating the essential message. I possess substantial financial resources and am willing to spend them irresponsibly to demonstrate my romantic seriousness. Please notice me and consider overlooking my obvious personality defects, questionable family background, and limited conversation skills. Unfortunately, by the time most letters completed their arduous delivery journey, traveling for multiple days in sweaty messenger satchels through rain, mud, seasonal flooding, perilous encounters with bandits, hostile animals, and the general chaos of medieval transportation systems shared with livestock, armed merchants, and various other travelers carrying their own aromatic cargo. They typically smelled like what generous observers might diplomatically describe as parchment stew, often with faint, lingering suggestions of whatever the delivery horses had been eating recently. Some particularly ambitious lovers incorporated fresh flower petals directly into their written correspondence, creating elaborate aromatic arrangements that required careful planning and precise seasonal timing to achieve optimal results. Dried violets represented modesty, unwavering faithfulness, and appropriate religious virtue, qualities that would especially appeal to families deeply concerned about their daughters' moral education and spiritual purity. Marjoram suggested joy, celebration, and optimistic expectations for positive romantic outcomes that would mutually benefit both families through advantageous alliance formation. Crushed rosemary was supposedly intended to enhance memory function, ensuring that recipients would vividly remember the sender's romantic interest without requiring additional herbal assistance, repeated romantic overtures, or potentially embarrassing public demonstrations of affection. One famously unfortunate suitor made the critical error of including fennel in his carefully crafted romantic correspondence, a blunder that was immediately interpreted as a deliberate and grave insult by the recipient's family and social circle. Apparently, fennel carried strong cultural associations with false flattery and deliberate insincerity, making it approximately as appropriate for romantic letters as including written disclaimers about questionable romantic intentions or obvious lies about personal wealth and social status. The mistake cost him not only his romantic prospects with the intended recipient, but also severely damaged his reputation within the broader community, where news of his botanical blunder spread quickly through gossip networks and became a cautionary tale about the vital importance of understanding symbolic plant meanings before attempting sophisticated aromatic correspondence. In particularly wealthy court circles, entire scrolls received thorough infusion with imported rosewater or expensive musk, not merely for subtle aromatic enhancement, but to ensure that the resulting fragrance would impact recipients with the overwhelming force of medieval perfume bombs. These were designed to announce romantic seriousness through sheer olfactory dominance that could be detected from considerable distances, leaving no doubt about the sender's intentions and resources. The morning mist hung heavy over the Norwegian fjord like a chilling funeral shroud, as Bjorn Ironside stood solemnly beside his father's funeral pyre, clutching the torch that would send the greatest Viking warrior of his generation to whatever realm awaited him beyond the cold, gray waters of death. But this was no ordinary funeral. This was a send-off that would be remembered for 1,000 years, a spectacle complete with treasure enough to bankrupt 3 kingdoms, a magnificent longship that had sailed to the very edges of the known world, and a human sacrifice that would make even the gods themselves take notice. Welcome to a world where death was never merely the end of any story. It was simply the opening chapter of a far more interesting and glorious adventure, an adventure that, hopefully, would involve considerably more mead, significantly fewer burdensome tax obligations, definitely better weather than life on Earth had provided during the long, brutal Scandinavian winters, and the kind of eternal glory that made all the suffering, violence, and daily struggle for survival seem entirely worthwhile in retrospect. This was a culture that turned dying into a profound art form, made anonymity a way of life, and often chose to die with honor rather than compromise their deeply held traditions in the face of changing times. The Norse approach to mortality was refreshingly practical and surprisingly optimistic, especially considering the harsh and often brutal realities of medieval life in Northern Europe. Since everyone was ultimately destined to die eventually anyway, regardless of their personal preferences, meticulous careful planning, or desperate attempts to avoid the inevitable through fervent prayer, primitive medicine, or simply hiding in their houses. Until the immediate danger passed, you might as well face it with considerable style, dramatic flair, unwavering courage, and the kind of spectacular send-off that would indelibly impress both the gods and your earthly enemies. Such a departure would ensure your name would be vividly remembered in epic stories told around roaring fires for countless generations after your physical form had inevitably returned to dust and fading memory. Viking culture, in its profound understanding of the afterlife, offered multiple distinct afterlife destinations, much like an ancient Nordic travel agency, providing a range of eternal vacation packages for the permanently deceased. However, the quality of accommodations, the availability of engaging activities, and your general satisfaction with the service varied significantly, depending not only on how you lived your life, but, more importantly, on the precise manner of your death and whether you managed to sufficiently impress the cosmic personnel responsible for afterlife assignments and supernatural customer service. Your final eternal destination depended primarily on your performance during life's ultimate unyielding test, the manner of your death, and the courage, skill, honor, and dramatic flair you demonstrably displayed during your final moments on Earth. While transitioning from a living warrior to a celebrated dead hero, thereby becoming eligible for various levels of divine recognition and eternal reward. If you manage to achieve a glorious warrior's death, with a blade still firmly clutched in your hand, unwavering courage resolute in your heart, defiance blazing on your lips, and enough reliable witnesses to truthfully verify your heroic behavior. For the meticulous cosmic record-keeping system, you had truly excellent chances of being personally selected by the ethereal Valkyries for premium afterlife accommodations. These promised rewards would make the suffering, violence, and daily struggle of earthly existence seem like a perfectly reasonable and worthwhile investment in eternal happiness and glory. These mythical female beings served as Odin's personal talent scouts and elite battlefield recruiters, tirelessly scouring combat zones throughout the known world to identify the bravest of the slain and recruit warriors deemed worthy of coveted places in Valhalla, Odin's exclusive and legendary mead hall, majestically located in Asgard. There, the honored dead would spend eternity tirelessly training for Ragnarok, the final, cataclysmic, apocalyptic battle that would ultimately determine the fate of all existence and definitively prove whether the gods or their formidable enemies would control the universe for whatever chaotic realm came after the ultimate end of everything. Valhalla was, in essence, an endless, glorious military academy with an unlimited supply of potent alcohol, absolutely no graduation requirements to hinder the eternal training, and the kind of rigorous training schedule that would make modern special forces weep with sheer exhaustion and profound envy. Warriors spent their days endlessly fighting each other in glorious, consequence-free combat, meticulously honing their skills through repeated death and miraculous resurrection. This unique cycle allowed them to experience every conceivable combat scenario, relentlessly testing new strategies and refining techniques that would be absolutely essential during the final, decisive battle, tirelessly preparing for the ultimate conflict that would demand every single lesson learned through centuries of practice and preparation. By night, they drank and feasted with wild abandon, as if it were truly their last day on Earth, which was technically accurate since they were already dead and existed outside normal mortal concepts of time, linear progression, and the annoying, Consequences of hangovers. The potent mead flowed endlessly from magical sources. The food was always perfectly prepared by supernatural chefs of unparalleled skill, and the entertainment included the finest skalds from throughout history, tirelessly reciting epic poetry about heroic deeds and legendary adventures, ensuring their immortality in verse. Then, they woke up the next morning, miraculously healed from any injuries sustained during the previous day's combat, completely refreshed despite having consumed impossible quantities of alcohol, and repeated the entire process indefinitely. This sounds either like a perfect, exhilarating paradise or the most exhausting eternity imaginable, depending entirely on your personal tolerance for repetitive violence, competitive drinking, and the kind of aggressive masculine camaraderie that regularly involves enthusiastically trying to kill your best friends for practice. However, not all souls found themselves bound for Valhalla's eternal warrior party and supernatural military training program. Freya, the powerful goddess of love and war, who possessed excellent taste in both romance and battlefield carnage, also claimed half of the battle slain to dwell in her magnificent hall, Folkvanger. This realm was apparently a more refined and aesthetically pleasing establishment, with better interior decorating, more sophisticated and nuanced conversation, possibly fewer brutal drinking contests, and definitely superior musical entertainment. Though the exact specific differences between Odin's and Freya's afterlife facilities remain tantalizingly unclear from surviving historical sources and archaeological evidence. Others might journey to Helheim, a shadowy, often bleak realm ruled by the formidable goddess Hel, especially if they died of sickness, succumbed to old age, perished in accidents, displayed cowardice in battle, or were simply deemed unworthy of warrior glory due to unfortunate timing, inadequate witnesses to their valor, insufficient dramatic flair during their final moments, or simply terrible luck during the divine selection process that ultimately determined eternal destinations. Helheim wasn't necessarily a place of torment and agonizing punishment like the grim Christian concept of hell. However, it wasn't exactly a festive or desirable destination either. One might consider it the cosmic equivalent of a mediocre retirement community, offering questionable entertainment options, limited and uninspiring social activities, a stifling bureaucratic administration, bland and repetitive food, and absolutely no possibility of early departure, relocation to more attractive neighborhoods, or any appeals process for individuals who felt they had been incorrectly assigned to substandard eternal accommodations. This rigid afterlife hierarchy mattered deeply to Viking society, which meticulously organized its entire value system, its complex social structure, its intricate legal system, and its very cultural identity around the unshakable belief that the precise circumstances of one's death determined their eternal destination. How you died, therefore, was deemed far more critically important than how you lived, how diligently you worked, how you treated your family and neighbors, or how you contributed to community welfare during the more mundane, boring, everyday aspects of existence that didn't involve glorious combat, heroic sacrifice, or the kind of dramatic theatrical gestures that were sure to impress divine observers. It also meant that funeral arrangements were critically important, not merely for honoring the deceased and providing a measure of comfort to grieving relatives who had lost loved ones to the relentless violence, rampant disease, unforeseen accidents, or the general pervasive hazards of medieval life. More crucially, these arrangements were paramount for ensuring that souls reached their appropriate supernatural destinations without getting hopelessly lost in cosmic bureaucracy, unduly delayed by administrative errors, or accidentally assigned to utterly inappropriate afterlife accommodations due to poor documentation, inadequate funeral preparation, or regrettable budget-conscious shortcuts that might inadvertently offend powerful divine authorities. The Vikings firmly believed that proper, meticulously executed funeral procedures could unequivocally guarantee a soul's smooth and unhindered passage to their intended eternal realm. Conversely, they feared that improper or neglected rites could result in profound spiritual confusion, outright afterlife rejection, interminable bureaucratic delays, or even the dreaded creation of restless, malevolent spirits. These tormented entities might, in their spiritual limbo, return to complain bitterly about poor service, loudly demand better funeral arrangements, seek vengeance against surviving relatives who had been insufficiently generous with funeral expenses, or simply haunt their descendants until someone provided appropriate posthumous customer service and diligently corrected the original, unforgivable mistakes. Whether involving dramatic cremation on flaming longships that symbolically carried souls across supernatural waters, elaborate burial in impressive mounds surrounded by valuable weapons and treasures that would be vitally needed in the afterlife, or more modest arrangements suitable for less wealthy families who simply couldn't afford spectacular funeral displays. The dead were universally treated with deep respect, meticulous attention to supernatural requirements, and often a genuine, pervasive fear of the dire consequences that might result from inadequate funeral planning, insufficient investment in appropriate ceremonies, or any budget-conscious shortcuts that could dangerously offend divine authorities and thereby create significant problems for entire family lineages, potentially for generations to come. When modern people imagine Viking funerals today, the most common and enduring image is that of majestic longships set ablaze, sailing dramatically into a fiery sunset while epic, stirring music plays heroically in the background. Mourners, in this romanticized vision, watch from the shore, solemnly raising drinking horns in final, heartfelt salutes to the departed warrior who is being grandly sent off to whatever glorious adventures await in the cosmic beyond. While Hollywood has certainly exaggerated this vivid image for maximum emotional impact, spectacular dramatic effect, and compelling cinematic appeal designed to sell movie tickets, that fiery vision isn't complete fantasy. It is, in fact, firmly rooted in actual Norse tradition, substantiated by archaeological evidence, and supported by various historical accounts. Although the grim reality was typically far more complicated, astronomically expensive, and logistically challenging than modern movies suggest. For the Vikings, ships weren't just utilitarian vehicles for conquering distant lands. Brutally raiding unsuspecting monasteries filled with tempting treasure and terrified monks, or bravely establishing perilous trade routes to exotic markets where northern furs could be profitably exchanged for southern luxuries. They were, profoundly, sacred vessels, imbued with mystical power, capable of crossing the mystical boundaries between different realms of existence, traveling through supernatural dimensions that ordinary mortals could never hope to reach through. Conventional transportation methods, normal human effort, or even any amount of accumulated wealth and meticulous, careful planning. In death as in life, ships powerfully symbolized passage, profound journey, spiritual transformation, thrilling adventure, and the inherent ability to traverse between worlds that existed far beyond the rigid physical limitations of earthly existence, where the normal rules of physics, linear time, and spatial relationships no longer applied. The ship was simultaneously the practical transportation for the deceased's physical remains, and a potent, profound spiritual metaphor for the soul's perilous journey from the known, tangible world of the living to the mysterious, unpredictable realms of the dead, where entirely different rules applied, thrilling new adventures awaited, and eternal destinies would be irrevocably determined by divine judgment and cosmic justice, making the ship a pivotal element in their cosmology. When high-status individuals died, chieftains who had led successful raids against foreign enemies, accomplished warriors who had earned reputations for courage and skill in combat, wealthy traders who had accumulated impressive fortunes through dangerous voyages, or noble women who had gained respect through wisdom, effective household management, or impressive political maneuvering. They were sometimes buried with their ship, in their ship, or on their ship, depending on local customs, available resources, family preferences, seasonal considerations, and the specific supernatural requirements their relatives believed necessary for proper afterlife transportation and divine recognition. The exact funeral ritual varied considerably depending on the geographic region, historical period, local religious traditions, available resources, political circumstances, family wealth, the deceased person's social status, personal preferences they had expressed during their lifetime, and specific achievements that determined appropriate honors and ceremonial recognition from the community. However, the symbolism remained remarkably consistent across different Viking communities, historical periods, and geographic regions. Send the soul off in style, with appropriate fanfare, adequate equipment for afterlife challenges, and the kind of dramatic spectacle that would impress both divine observers watching from supernatural realms and human witnesses who would remember and retell the story for generations, ensuring the deceased person's fame and reputation would survive long after their physical form had been consumed by fire or returned to the earth. In coastal regions, especially around Norway and Sweden, where ships were readily available due to extensive maritime culture and water access, made nautical funerals practically possible without excessive transportation costs, logistical complications, or the need to drag heavy vessels across difficult terrain. It was common to dig large trenches shaped like ship hulls, place real vessels inside these earthen frameworks, and arrange bodies within the boats along with carefully selected grave goods that would serve the deceased in whatever challenges, opportunities, adventures, and responsibilities awaited them in their next phase of existence. These grave goods weren't just sentimental tokens chosen for emotional significance or decorative elements selected for aesthetic appeal. They were practical tools, valuable provisions, essential weapons, precious jewelry, and meaningful symbols, meant to equip the dead for specific trials, supernatural responsibilities, divine tests, and cosmic adventures that awaited them in the afterlife, where they would need appropriate equipment to fulfill their eternal obligations, maintain their status within divine hierarchies, and successfully navigate whatever challenges the gods might present to test their worthiness for continued existence in supernatural realms. Warriors received their best weapons, often including swords that had seen successful combat and carried the spiritual power of victory, axes that had split enemy shields and earned reputations for effectiveness, sturdy defensive equipment that had protected their owners through countless battles and dangerous situations, and sometimes complete suits of armor that had been crafted by master smiths and blessed by religious authorities for enhanced protective power against both earthly and supernatural threats. Some of these weapons were deliberately bent, broken, or otherwise damaged before burial, a symbolic gesture designed to kill the weapon so it could accompany its owner's soul into the next world, where spiritual, rather than physical properties, would determine effectiveness, while also serving the practical secondary purpose of discouraging grave robbers who might be tempted to steal valuable equipment from burial sites if they thought the items were still functional and could be resold for profit. This practice of weapon destruction reflected complex Viking beliefs about the relationship between physical and spiritual realms, the need to transform earthly objects for supernatural use through ritual killing that released their spiritual essence, and the importance of preventing inappropriate reuse of sacred items that had been dedicated to afterlife service through funeral ceremonies and religious blessing that made them unsuitable for ordinary human use. Wealthy Vikings were buried with gold and silver coins that could serve as currency in afterlife realms where economic transactions might be necessary. Drinking horns decorated with precious metals and intricate carvings that would be appropriate for use in divine feasting halls. Imported luxury items like Chinese silk that demonstrated international trading connections, Indian spices that represented exotic wealth, Byzantine jewelry that showed sophisticated taste, and Frankish metalwork that indicated access to the finest craftsmen and most expensive materials available in the medieval world. Women might be interred with intricate brooches that showed their family's wealth and artistic taste while serving practical functions for clothing and personal decoration in the afterlife. Keys that symbolized their authority over household, management, and domestic responsibilities that would continue in supernatural realms. Looms and other textile equipment that reflected their productive skills and economic contributions to their families, or jewelry that indicated their marriage, status, family connections, and social position within community hierarchies that would persist beyond death. The keys, in Viking culture, were particularly significant symbols that represented women's profound power over household resources, their inherent responsibility for meticulously managing family wealth and property, their undeniable authority over servants and intricate domestic arrangements, their crucial role as guardians of family honor and social reputation through proper hospitality and impeccably appropriate behavior, and their vital function as intermediaries between their husbands, demanding public activities and their children's essential education and moral development, underscoring their multifaceted and indispensable contributions to societal stability. Children, too, were often buried with cherished toys that were believed to provide entertainment and comfort during their supernatural childhood. Small animals that could serve as loyal companions and protective guardians during their afterlife. Development. Miniature versions of adult equipment that would help them learn and develop appropriate skills for their eventual adult responsibilities in the next world, or gaming pieces that would allow them to actively participate in the intellectual and social activities that characterized civilized afterlife society and divine entertainment, ensuring their continued growth. Some children's graves notably included elaborate wooden boats carved with intricate decorations and powerful magical symbols, suggesting that Vikings believed young people would need transportation for afterlife travel and adventures just like adults. Other burials featured carved animals that could serve as spiritual guides, weapons scaled to child-sized proportions for their eventual training as formidable supernatural warriors, or craft tools that indicated expectations about continued learning, and skill development in cosmic realms where education and personal growth would continue throughout eternity, mirroring earthly aspirations. But let's not forget the larger, more substantial accessories that characterized the most elaborate and extraordinarily expensive Viking funerals. Massive investments in afterlife preparation that demonstrably showcased family wealth, elevated social status, and a genuine, unyielding commitment to ensuring their loved ones received appropriate and highly favorable treatment in supernatural realms. Horses, loyal dogs, noble falcons, and even entire, fully equipped boats might be included in major burial arrangements, alongside human companions such as servants, slaves, or retainers. These individuals were tragically believed to be necessary for maintaining the deceased person's earthly status and meticulously meeting their every service need in afterlife realms, where social hierarchies and domestic arrangements were believed to continue functioning precisely according to earthly patterns, perpetuating their earthly power dynamics beyond the grave. And yes, in particularly high-status burials involving revered kings, powerful jarls, or other individuals whose deaths warranted maximum ceremonial recognition and expenditure, human sacrifices were, disturbing as it is, not unheard of. In fact, they were meticulously documented by Arab travelers and other foreign observers who personally witnessed these solemn and often horrific ceremonies, recording their shock, profound fascination, and utter horror at the elaborate ritual. Killings that tragically accompanied major Viking funerals. Slaves, servants, concubines, or retainers, often deliberately drugged with potent alcohol or strong herbal preparations to significantly reduce their resistance and, ostensibly, to ease their transition to death while minimizing the psychological trauma for both the victims and the observers, were firmly believed to accompany their masters into the afterlife to serve them there. They were expected to provide continuous domestic labor, companionship, sexual services, and various forms of assistance that would be absolutely necessary for maintaining appropriate standards of living and comfort in supernatural realms, where continued comfort and status would depend directly on having adequate staff and proper household arrangements, chillingly replicating earthly inequalities. This grim and deeply disturbing practice represents one of the most morally reprehensible aspects of Viking funeral culture, a stark and unsettling reminder that Norse society, for all its celebrated poetry, adventurous exploration, remarkable artistic achievements, and heroic ideals, also embraced brutal, rigid hierarchies and profoundly dehumanizing practices. These practices treated certain categories of people as mere property to be disposed of entirely according to their owner's convenience. Their deeply held religious beliefs about afterlife requirements and pervasive social expectations about appropriate funeral arrangements for individuals of high status. The human sacrifice tradition chillingly reflected deeply embedded Viking beliefs about the unbreakable nature of social relationships, unyielding divine expectations, and the continuing perceived need for domestic service in supernatural realms. However, it also starkly demonstrated the profound inequality, casual violence, and systematic devaluation of human life that characterized medieval Scandinavian society, starkly distinguishing between free persons who possessed inherent rights and legal protections, and enslaved individuals who could be killed, sold, traded, or otherwise disposed of entirely according to their owner's wishes, often without any legal consequences or social disapproval whatsoever. The most detailed and chilling account of such a ritual comes from Ibn Fadlan, a 10th century Arab diplomat who personally witnessed a Viking funeral on the Volga River and described in disturbing, graphic detail the ritual killing of a female slave. She was tragically referred to as the Angel of Death in his account, and she either volunteered or was selected to join her master in the afterlife through a process that involved days of meticulous preparation, ritual intoxication, ceremonial, sexual activity, and public celebration, before culminating in her strangulation and subsequent stabbing by multiple participants, while the deceased master's magnificent ship was simultaneously set ablaze around them. The process itself was neither quick nor merciful, involving prolonged psychological preparation, intense social pressure, pervasive religious indoctrination, and distressing physical abuse, all designed to ensure the victim's compliance while maximizing the ceremonial and spiritual impact of her sacrifice for the assembled community. Ibn Fadlan's harrowing account provides graphic details about the victim's treatment, the participants' ritualistic behavior, and the crowd's complex reactions that vividly reveal the intricate social dynamics, the powerful religious beliefs, and the deeply ingrained cultural values that made such practices not only acceptable but, horrifyingly, essential components of proper funeral arrangements for wealthy and powerful individuals within Viking society. Disturbing, absolutely. But to the Vikings directly involved in these ceremonies, human sacrifice was considered a sacred, undeniable duty, possibly even a profound honor for the victims themselves, and most certainly a necessary component of ensuring their masters received appropriate afterlife accommodation and divine recognition. The practice, in their eyes, reflected genuine religious conviction about supernatural requirements rather than simply sadistic entertainment or casual cruelty, though the critical distinction between religious obligation and systematic brutality may seem utterly meaningless to modern observers who view any form of human sacrifice as fundamentally wrong, regardless of the perpetrator's motivations or the specific cultural context in which it occurred. The choices meticulously made about grave goods were deeply deliberate, spiritually significant, and often profoundly personal, intimately reflecting the deceased person's individual preferences, their earthly achievements, their vital relationships, and their anticipated needs in whatever afterlife destination awaited them. This destination was based on their earthly behavior and divine judgment regarding their worthiness for various supernatural accommodations and eternal responsibilities. Interestingly, these customs and practices varied significantly by geographic region, specific historical period, deeply ingrained family traditions, prevailing local political circumstances, available resources, and the nuances of local religious beliefs that heavily influenced funeral arrangements and determined appropriate grave goods for different types of people and varying death circumstances. In Sweden, for example, elaborate boat graves with extensive and valuable grave goods were considerably more common than in other Scandinavian regions. In contrast, in Iceland, burial practices were often notably simpler due to scarce natural resources, limited access to luxury imports, harsh environmental conditions, and practical constraints imposed by the island's isolation and difficult climate, necessitating a more pragmatic approach. Some Norse settlements and communities developed distinctive burial traditions that ingeniously blended pagan grave goods with early Christian symbols and religious practices, as the slow, gradual process of conversion crept through Scandinavian societies over several centuries. This created unique hybrid funeral arrangements that bravely attempted to satisfy both traditional ancestral beliefs and newer religious requirements without completely abandoning either system of spiritual belief and practice, or inadvertently offending divine authorities from different religious traditions. A delicate balance of faith. Grave goods weren't just about equipping and honoring the dead. They told profoundly important stories to the living about who someone was during their lifetime, what they valued and accomplished, how they died and why their death mattered, and how, They should be remembered by future generations. These descendants would visit their graves, tell stories about their achievements, and use their examples as inspiration or warning about appropriate behavior and life choices that purportedly led to success, honor, and divine favor, making the grave a narrative of life. To a Viking, a meticulously well-packed grave wasn't a morbid ritual primarily focused on death and decay. It was, fundamentally, a final, powerful demonstration of respect, meticulous care, and deep love, a definitive statement of the deceased person's worth and enduring significance. It was, perhaps, even a spiritual passport, or a recommendation letter for divine authorities who would ultimately determine eternal destinations and assign appropriate afterlife accommodations based on earthly evidence about character, achievements, and crucial social relationships that demonstrably showcased worthiness for various levels of supernatural recognition and eternal reward. A Viking funeral was never a quick goodbye or a simple utilitarian disposal of unwanted remains. It was a major, momentous event, a grand and often multi-day affair steeped in solemn ceremony, profound symbolism, intricate religious ritual, and the kind of dramatic, theatrical flair that only Norse culture could organize and execute with appropriate dramatic impact and widespread community participation. After all, if your death was truly supposed to be the glorious start of an epic journey to supernatural realms where you would spend eternity in honor, your send-off absolutely needed to match the immense magnitude of the transition and demonstrate proper, unwavering respect for both the honored deceased and the powerful divine authorities who would be receiving their soul into the cosmic tapestry. The ceremonies commenced with the elaborate and respectful preparation of the body, which would be meticulously washed and dressed in the deceased person's finest clothing, sometimes with cosmetic enhancement or symbolic masks carefully applied to preserve their appearance and dignity during the extended funeral process. This vital task typically fell to women in the community who were widely seen as spiritual caretakers of life and death transitions, responsible for ensuring the deceased looked impeccably appropriate for their presentation to powerful divine authorities and the assembled community witnesses. These women might be professional mourners with specialized knowledge of intricate funeral procedures, family members with particular inherited skills in corpse preparation, or esteemed priestesses known as vulvas who wielded significant ritual authority and were profoundly believed to possess supernatural insights about afterlife requirements and divine expectations for proper funeral arrangements, bridging the mortal and spiritual realms. Then came the crucial gathering phase, where family members, close friends, loyal warriors from allied clans, and sometimes even entire villages would come together to honor the dead in elaborate celebrations. These solemn yet vibrant events skillfully combined elements of profound mourning with joyous feasting, sacred religious ceremony with essential social networking, and heartfelt grief with powerful community bonding that significantly strengthened relationships and demonstrably showcased collective support for the bereaved family. In wealthier funerals involving high-status individuals, guests might travel long distances to attend these highly significant social events, creating invaluable opportunities for political negotiation, critical business discussion, advantageous marriage arrangements, and crucial alliance formation, all serving multiple purposes beyond simply honoring the deceased. These were deeply communal and impactful moments that functioned as a powerful combination of religious services, political conventions, economic conferences, and grand social gatherings that profoundly affected entire regions and influenced complex relationships between different communities for years or even decades, shaping the future. Think of it, then, as a solemn wake, but one augmented with competitive drinking, intense political intrigue, shrewd economic negotiation, and the kind of high-stakes religious ceremony that could truly determine your eternal destiny, depending on how well your family managed the complex logistical, financial, and spiritual requirements of providing appropriate funeral arrangements that would impressively satisfy both divine observers and discerning human witnesses. One of the most powerful and fundamentally important figures in the funeral ritual was the sacrificer, typically a priest, a powerful chieftain, or another individual with appropriate religious authority who was solely responsible for conducting the ceremonial aspects of the funeral, and meticulously ensuring that all spiritual requirements were precisely met according to established traditions and perceived divine expectations. This pivotal role could include the grave responsibility for blood offerings, which might involve animal sacrifice, human sacrifice, or both, depending entirely on the deceased person's exalted status and the family's immense resources and unwavering religious commitments. Horses and loyal dogs were commonly sacrificed to accompany the deceased into the next life, symbolizing companionship and service. While in rare, chilling cases involving elite individuals, slaves might be given intoxicants, brutally strangled, stabbed, or otherwise killed, and ritually placed beside their master as final acts of service and unquestioning loyalty, grimly demonstrating the master's immense power and wealth even in death, perpetuating their earthly dominance into the spiritual realm. Music and poetry were absolutely essential components of Viking funeral ceremonies, with highly skilled skalds performing elaborate and often extemporaneous compositions that meticulously recounted the deceased person's exploits in battle, their adventurous travels to distant lands, their successful raids and profitable trading expeditions, their generous hospitality and lavish gift-giving, and their myriad other achievements that profoundly deserved recognition and remembrance by future generations. These descendants would then preserve their memory in rich oral traditions, ensuring their legacy endured. These powerful verses weren't just simple entertainment for funeral guests. They served crucial historical and spiritual functions by preserving vital information about individual accomplishments, intricate family genealogies, and significant community events. Simultaneously, they ensured that the deceased person's hard-won reputation and cherished legacy would survive in stories told around crackling fires for generations after their physical death, transcending mortality through narrative. The sheer quality and meticulous accuracy of the funeral poetry could quite literally determine whether individuals would be remembered as celebrated heroes, infamous villains, or tragically forgotten entirely by future generations, making skalds incredibly powerful figures whose artistic and historical judgments had lasting, often irreversible consequences for families and entire communities throughout Scandinavian society. Then came the solemn climax of the entire ceremony, the actual burial or cremation process itself. This varied in grandeur, whether it involved a majestic ship burial, a profound mound interment, or cremation on elaborate pyres that would fiercely consume the deceased along with their carefully selected grave goods and any sacrificial offerings that had been prepared for the momentous occasion. During cremation ceremonies, the emotional peak occurred as towering flames rose higher and higher, consuming everything that had been placed on the pyre. Mourners might then shout heartfelt farewells, offer final toasts with horns brimming with mead or ale, or place last-minute personal items into the fiery inferno as final symbolic gifts or messages for the deceased to carry with them into the afterlife, forging a final connection. For burial ceremonies, the climactic moment arrived as rich soil fell rhythmically onto the grave, slowly covering the deceased and their cherished possessions forever, while family members and friends uttered their final goodbyes and made their peace with the stark reality that they would never see their beloved one again in this earthly world, though they held fervent hope of being reunited in whatever supernatural realm awaited them after their own deaths. After the burial or cremation was complete, the grand funeral feast began, and these were by no means modest gatherings with light refreshments and polite conversation. Viking funeral feasts were elaborate, boisterous celebrations involving massive quantities of meat, copious amounts of mead and ale, and various other foods that proudly demonstrated the family's wealth and generosity. Simultaneously, they provided vital opportunities for community bonding, spirited storytelling about the deceased's deeds, and the kind of competitive drinking that Norse culture considered absolutely essential for properly honoring the deceased and strengthening communal ties. The feasting wasn't just indulgent celebration. It served crucial spiritual and social functions by sharing communal meals that honored the dead, powerfully reaffirmed bonds among the living, and demonstrably showcased unwavering community support for the bereaved family during their profound time of grief and transition. Life continued after death, but memory and relationships persisted through shared meals, cherished stories, and ongoing connections that powerfully bound communities together across generations, making the living an extension of the departed's legacy. These elaborate funeral rituals did far more than simply bury bodies and dispose of the dead. They helped actively process grief, legitimize vital inheritance claims, preserve social order, strengthen community bonds, and provide profound frameworks for understanding death that made the inevitable transition from life seem meaningful and purposeful, rather than simply random, terrifying, or devoid of significance. A Viking funeral was inherently less about death and more about legacy, enduring memory, community solidarity, and the ongoing intricate relationships between the living and the dead that continued to influence daily life long after the funeral. Fires had burned out and the burial mounds had been covered with grass and seemingly forgotten by everyone except dedicated family members who continued to visit and honor their ancestors' memory, ensuring their immortality in spirit. If there's one detail about Viking funerals that consistently tends to raise eyebrows, provoke moral outrage, and fundamentally challenge modern sensibilities about human rights and basic decency, it's the well-documented practice of human sacrifice that occurred during some of the more elaborate funeral ceremonies, particularly those involving revered kings, powerful jarls, and other high-status individuals whose deaths warranted maximum ceremonial recognition and religious investment. Human sacrifice was a grim reality, meticulously documented by multiple historical sources, and while it wasn't part of every Viking funeral or even most funerals, when it did tragically happen, it made a lasting, profound impression on both participants and observers. It created haunting memories and stories that persisted for generations and deeply influenced how people understood the complex relationship between life, death, power, and religious obligation in Norse society, a dark aspect of their cosmology. In Viking cosmology and their intricate religious understanding, the afterlife was essentially perceived as a direct continuation of earthly life, complete with remarkably similar social structures, familiar domestic arrangements, and enduring personal relationships that required ongoing maintenance and support. So, if a powerful chieftain or formidable warlord had numerous servants, loyal guards, favored concubines, or devoted retainers while living, it made perfect, logical sense from their perspective that he would want and profoundly need the exact same support staff in the next world to maintain his elevated status, ensure his comfort, and guarantee his ability to fulfill whatever cosmic responsibilities awaited him in supernatural realms. Only, of course, those companions and servants had to reach the afterlife through the same ultimate transition that everyone else experienced, death, which chillingly meant they needed to die at approximately the same time as their master, if they were to be readily available for continued service in whatever cosmic destination he was assigned by powerful divine authorities, ensuring a grim continuity of service. Once her participation in the grim ritual was confirmed, the selected slave woman was treated as a special, almost consecrated person for the remaining days leading up to the funeral. She was given fine clothes and valuable jewelry, allowed to participate freely in community celebrations, and consistently provided with alcohol and other potent intoxicants. These substances kept her in a continuous state of ritual intoxication, which was intended to reduce her awareness of the terrifying reality of what was happening and to make her more compliant with the demanding ceremonial requirements. During this preparation period, she was also disturbingly required to participate in ritual sexual activities with various men in the community, which Ibn Fadlan described as religious ceremonies rather than simple assault. Though this distinction remains meaningless from the victim's perspective, and certainly does not make the practices any less disturbing or exploitative from a modern viewpoint that prioritizes human rights. The final, horrifying ceremony took place on the deceased master's ship, which had been meticulously prepared as a funeral pyre. The master's body, his valuable grave goods, and other offerings were arranged according to established traditions. The slave woman was then led onto the ship, given even more intoxicants to further ensure her compliance and subdue any lingering resistance, and subsequently killed through a chilling combination of strangulation and stabbing by multiple participants while the ship was simultaneously set ablaze around them, engulfing all in flames. Ibn Fadlan's account meticulously emphasizes the ritualistic nature of the killing, the participants' grave and serious demeanor, and the community's universal treatment of the events as a sacred religious ceremony rather than mere entertainment or casual violence. However, his vivid description also makes clear that the victim experienced profound terror, excruciating pain, and fierce resistance during her final moments, unequivocally suggesting that whatever profound religious significance the ceremony held, for the participants, it was experienced as an act of murder by the person being killed, a stark and undeniable truth. This practice is disturbing beyond measure and completely unacceptable by modern standards of human rights, individual dignity, and basic moral behavior. But to the Vikings directly involved in these ceremonies, human sacrifice was considered a sacred, undeniable duty that honored both the deceased master and, in their warped view, the sacrificial victim, while simultaneously ensuring proper spiritual arrangements for afterlife accommodation and divine recognition. The practice reflected a genuine, deeply held religious conviction about supernatural requirements, social obligations, and cosmic justice rather than simply sadistic entertainment or casual cruelty. Though to modern observers who view any form of human sacrifice as fundamentally wrong, regardless of the perpetrator's motivations, cultural context, or sincere belief in the spiritual necessity of their actions, the distinction between religious obligation and systematic brutality may seem utterly meaningless. However, it is absolutely crucial to be clear about the pervasive social and political context that made such horrific practices possible and acceptable in Viking society. This was a brutally patriarchal and rigidly hierarchical society that treated women, slaves, and other vulnerable individuals as mere property to be owned, used, and ruthlessly disposed of according to the preferences and perceived needs of more powerful men who held absolute control over their lives and deaths. The human sacrifice tradition wasn't just about religious belief. It was intrinsically about power, control, and the systematic devaluation of certain categories of human life. This devaluation made it possible for wealthy and powerful individuals to treat other people as expendable resources whose only perceived value came from their usefulness to their social superiors, a chilling testament to social inequality. Fortunately for the intended targets and their families, who presumably preferred their relatives continue living rather than serving as macabre funeral accessories for dead masters, they may have had no particular loyalty to, or affection for, not all. Sacrifices involved human victims, animals, especially horses and dogs, which held special symbolic value in Norse culture, were far more commonly killed to accompany the dead in funeral ceremonies that satisfied religious requirements while avoiding the extreme ethical complications and practical difficulties associated with human sacrifice. These animal sacrifices, however, still represented significant economic investments for the families organizing funerals, since horses and dogs were valuable working animals that contributed significantly to household productivity, transportation, protection, and other essential functions that would be irrevocably lost when the animals were killed for ceremonial purposes. The sacrificed creatures symbolized strength, unwavering loyalty, companionship, and supernatural guidance that would be invaluable assets for souls traveling between worlds and establishing themselves in new realms where they would need reliable allies, effective transportation, trusted companions, and spiritual guides who could help them navigate unfamiliar territories and complex social situations in the afterlife. Over time, especially as Christian missionary activity steadily increased throughout Scandinavian territories, and Christian kings gradually gained greater political power in Norse communities, the horrific practice of human sacrifice mercifully faded from Viking funeral culture. Christian clerics were utterly horrified by these barbaric rituals, and relentlessly used them as undeniable evidence of pagan barbarism that desperately needed to be eliminated through widespread religious conversion and sweeping legal reform. Local kings, eager to align themselves with powerful European Christian kingdoms and gain crucial access to their influential political networks, began systematically outlawing human sacrifice and other pagan practices that were seen as formidable obstacles to vital diplomatic relationships and advantageous international trade agreements that could significantly benefit their territories economically and politically. By the 11th century, most Viking territories had officially abandoned the practice of human sacrifice, though some remote communities, clinging to ancient ways, continued these traditions in secret for several more generations before finally succumbing to the overwhelming Christian pressure and legal prohibition that made such practices dangerously untenable for both participants and organizers. Some burial mounds were modest affairs that could be completed by immediate family members and close friends working together for several days, requiring a relatively small collective effort. In stark contrast, others were massive undertakings, spanning over 100 feet in diameter, and necessitating coordinated labor from entire communities working tirelessly for weeks or even months to complete the construction according to established engineering principles and aesthetic standards, transforming them into significant architectural feats. Many burial mounds were strikingly surrounded by rings of standing stones, meticulously arranged in ship-like formations. This enhanced their inherent maritime symbolism, while simultaneously creating sacred defined spaces for ongoing ritual activities and important community gatherings. These gatherings served to maintain vital connections between the living and the dead over extended periods, making the mounds enduring centers of communal life. Others were topped with prominent wooden poles, intricately carved monuments, or elaborately decorated posts that served as clear focal points for memorial activities. These additions also provided additional height and visibility, enhancing the mound's crucial function as a territorial marker and a grand family advertisement, visible from great distances, asserting their presence and power. But burial mounds weren't merely memorial architecture. They were also powerful political statements. They functioned as permanent, undeniable declarations of territorial control and family dominance, significantly influencing regional power dynamics for generations after their original construction. A chieftain's burial mound, for instance, wasn't simply a grave marker. It was a formidable monument to his continuing influence, asserting his family's claims to specific lands, valuable resources, and inherent authority that should rightfully be inherited by his descendants and respected by neighboring communities, enforcing a lasting legacy. Local communities would continue to gather at these sacred sites for seasonal festivals, crucial religious ceremonies, solemn oath-making rituals, and important political meetings. These gatherings maintained the profound connection between past and present, while consistently reinforcing the social hierarchies and territorial arrangements that had been firmly established by the influential individuals commemorated within these enduring earthen monuments. The dead, it seemed, never truly departed from their communities. They simply changed the nature of their presence and continued to influence daily life through the tangible physical monuments that preserved their memory and the ongoing ritual, activities that diligently maintained their spiritual connection to the world of the living. Even today, countless burial mounds scattered across the Scandinavian landscape remain powerful, evocative reminders of Viking culture. They continue to influence local communities through thriving tourism, meticulous archaeological research, and a deep sense of cultural pride that intimately connects modern Scandinavians to their ancient heritage and remarkable historical achievements that have been preserved within these earthen monuments for over 1,000 years. These grassy hills, gently undulating across the Nordic landscape, aren't just mere accumulations of dirt and stone covering ancient bones. They are living monuments to legacy, enduring memory, and the fundamental human desire for permanent recognition that transcends the brief span of individual life. They create lasting, tangible connections between generations separated by centuries of profound historical change and cultural transformation. They represent the astounding achievements of a people who fundamentally understood that being remembered was the only reliable path to immortality. A people who were willing to invest enormous resources in creating physical monuments that would meticulously preserve their names and achievements long after their bodies had returned to dust and their immediate descendants had been forgotten by everyone except the very stones and earth that marked their final hallowed resting places. While much of Viking history predominantly focuses on the blood-soaked adventures of male warriors boldly raiding foreign shores and conquering distant territories, Viking funeral practices reveal a more complex and nuanced society. In this society, women played central, powerful, and sometimes dangerous roles that profoundly challenged simplistic assumptions about rigid gender hierarchies and feminine agency in medieval Scandinavian culture. Viking women were not merely passive mourners standing at the edges of graves. while men made all the important decisions about funeral arrangements and afterlife provisions. In many significant cases, they were central, commanding figures who controlled crucial aspects of funeral planning, intricate religious ceremony, and vital spiritual guidance that directly determined whether the deceased would receive appropriate treatment in supernatural realms. One of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries related to Viking funeral culture is the spectacular Oseberg ship burial, unearthed in Norway. This incredible find contained not the remains of a male warrior, as might be expected, but rather two high-status women who were buried in a lavish wooden ship, along with an incredible collection of grave goods. These included exquisite silk textiles, intricate wood carvings, substantial food supplies, and even a complete four-wheeled wagon, strongly suggesting they were preparing for extensive travel in the afterlife. The women were laid to rest in regal splendor that rivaled or even exceeded the funeral arrangements provided for many prominent male warriors and political leaders. This astonishing fact powerfully suggests that feminine achievement, spiritual authority, or strong family connections could fully justify elaborate funeral investments that demonstrably showcased deep respect for women's contributions to their communities and clear recognition of their continuing importance even after death, challenging conventional views of gender roles. The precise identities of the Oseberg women remain a tantalizing mystery, despite extensive archaeological investigation and scholarly analysis. But most experts strongly believe that at least one of them may have been a vulva, a Norse priestess, seer, or powerful spiritual leader who possessed significant ritual authority and was widely believed to have supernatural insights about divine will, future events, and the cosmic forces that governed both earthly and spiritual affairs. In Norse culture, vulvas held immense spiritual power that was both deeply respected and profoundly feared by community members who depended on their crucial guidance for important decisions about everything from optimal agricultural timing to strategic military maneuvers to complex marriage arrangements that required divine approval or supernatural insight to ensure success and avoid cosmic displeasure, highlighting their vital societal role. These women, often referred to as vulvas, were frequently responsible for meticulously preparing the dead for their spiritual journey, conducting complex purification rituals that would ensure proper reception in supernatural realms, performing the intricate incantations and ceremonies that would guide souls safely through the dangerous transition between life and death, and providing the crucial spiritual expertise that families desperately needed to arrange appropriate and ritually correct funeral ceremonies for their deceased relatives. Their prominent presence in funeral rites afforded them a rare but incredibly potent spiritual authority that extended far beyond normal gender restrictions, allowing them to exercise significant influence over religious matters that were considered absolutely essential for community welfare and individual salvation within the vast cosmic order that governed the Viking understanding of life, death, and divine justice. The vulva's integral role in funeral ceremonies often involved complex ritual activities that demanded specialized knowledge of supernatural requirements, divine preferences, and mystical spiritual technologies that could influence afterlife assignments and ensure that deceased community members received appropriate treatment from the cosmic authorities who held ultimate control over eternal destinies. And then, there were the legendary shield maidens, women who, according to sagas and some archaeological interpretations, fought bravely alongside men in combat and sometimes earned the same fiery farewells and coveted warrior honors that were traditionally reserved exclusively for male heroes who had distinguished themselves through extraordinary courage, exceptional skill, and notable achievement in battle against formidable enemies. While historical evidence for the literal existence of shield maidens remains hotly debated among scholars and may involve more legend than definitively documented fact, some archaeological discoveries strongly suggest that at least some women did indeed receive military honors and warrior funeral arrangements. These findings indicate that they had earned significant recognition for martial achievements and combat service that qualified them for the same glorious afterlife destinations and ceremonial treatment as their male counterparts. The most famous potential example is the Birka warrior burial discovered in Sweden, which contained female remains interred with full military honors, including an array of weapons, riding gear, gaming pieces, and other items unequivocally associated with professional military service and warrior culture. This strongly suggested that this woman had achieved a remarkable and respected status through her martial accomplishments. These fascinating discoveries profoundly challenged traditional assumptions about rigid gender roles in Viking society and suggest that truly exceptional women could, at times, transcend normal social restrictions to achieve recognition, authority, and memorial treatment based on individual merit and valor, rather than simply their relationships to powerful men or their success in traditional feminine domestic roles. However, it is crucial to acknowledge that not all women's roles in Viking funeral culture were heroic, empowering, or freely chosen. Female slaves and concubines were, tragically, sometimes sacrificed during elaborate funeral ceremonies for powerful men, as Ibn Fadlan's disturbing account vividly reveals. These women served as unwilling participants in brutal religious rituals that treated them as disposable property rather than as individuals with inherent dignity and fundamental rights to life and self-determination. These women were offered, or more accurately, forced into death to serve their masters in the afterlife, creating grim reminders of the brutal hierarchies and systematic inequality that characterized Viking society despite its prevailing reputation for adventure, exploration, and heroic achievement, a reputation that often tends to overshadow the darker, more uncomfortable aspects of Norse culture and social organization. The practice of female sacrifice starkly reveals the profound gender inequality and deeply dehumanizing attitudes that made it tragically possible for powerful men to treat women as utterly expendable resources whose lives had value only in relation to their usefulness for masculine pleasure, domestic service, or the perceived religious obligations that required human offerings to satisfy divine requirements or social expectations about appropriate funeral arrangements. A truly chilling display of power. Still, Viking funeral practices, despite their grim aspects, hint at a society that was more complex and contradictory than simple patriarchal domination. Evidence suggests that Norse culture could be simultaneously oppressive and liberating, rigidly traditional and remarkably innovative, deeply respectful and overtly exploitative in its treatment of women, depending entirely on their social status, individual achievements, family connections, and the specific circumstances that determined their roles within the community's complex power structures. Women could function as solemn mourners, powerful spiritual officials, honored dead, or tragic sacrificial victims, depending on their position within the intricate social hierarchies and the particular requirements of different funeral situations that called for different types of feminine participation in religious ceremonies and community memorial activities. Their graves, whether lavishly rich with potent symbols of authority and achievement, or simple, stark markers of lives tragically cut short by violence and exploitation, powerfully remind us that Norse culture was not simply about conquest and combat, but encompassed complex and often brutal relationships between different categories of people whose experiences of life and death varied dramatically based on their gender, social status, economic resources, and individual circumstances that determined their opportunities for agency, recognition, and dignified memorial treatment within Viking communities. The uncertainty and unpredictability were essential parts of the Bauta mask's profound power and significant social impact. Unlike more theatrical masks that clearly conveyed specific emotions, character types, or direct social messages, which provided immediate clues about the wearer's mood, intentions, or role in whatever social drama was unfolding, the Bauta had no expression at all. There was no smile, no frown, no decorative flourishes or artistic elements that might reveal anything about the person behind the disguise. It was, in essence, the anti-mask, faceless and formless, yet profoundly loaded with psychological meaning and intense social significance. This made it simultaneously fascinating and terrifying for both wearers and observers who participated in the temporary transformation of Venetian society. During periods when normal social rules were suspended, different possibilities became available for social interaction and personal expression, and the Bauta reigned supreme. This inherent paradox made it the most powerful mask of all in the rich Venetian tradition, because it represented pure possibility. It offered the chance to be anyone, to do anything, to say whatever you truly thought, and crucially, to escape all normal consequences. This was achieved through the simple act of removing a piece of white plaster when the game was over, and ordinary social reality resumed its control over daily life and individual behavior. In time, the Bauta became emblematic of Venice itself, elegant yet mysterious, sophisticated yet threatening, beautiful yet dangerous. It represented a culture that valued both order and chaos, tradition and innovation, collective harmony and individual freedom in complex combinations that created one of the most fascinating and influential societies in European history.